What I wanted to talk about today was Russia, and more specifically, Spengler's perspective on Russia and Alexander Dugin's thought and the connections between the two, which are pretty significant and striking. And I know that you know a lot about this topic. So maybe I'll begin by just noting a few general and Russia specific similarities that I've noted between Spengler and Dugin. General similarities include the fact that both of them are pretty postmodern in how they evaluate cultures. They do not believe that there's some overarching frame of reference by which you can evaluate different cultures. Instead, you simply need to understand them as well as you can. And it sort of is nonsensical for one culture to judge another culture by reference to its own value. So that's something I think the two have in common. Another thing they have in common is that they celebrate true diversity, that is civilizational or cultural diversity. They respect each civilization. They really attempt to understand it. They demand the right, especially in Dugin's case, to preserve their own civilization. But they also celebrate and respect other civilizations' right to preserve their civilizations. So I think those are some interesting kind of general points of commonality between Spengler and Dugin. And then more specifically with respect to Russia, obviously Dugin focuses on Russia, not exclusively, but he's Russian and is more focused on Russia than on any other country, whereas that was not true for Spengler. But Spengler did have interesting things to say about Russia. And he, like so many civilizational theorists, really did regard Russia as distinct from the West and a civilization in its own right. That's actually an interesting thing that Spengler, Toynbee, Quigley, and many others Huntington have in common. They do not buy the notion that Russia is part of Europe or part of the West. So with respect to Russia specifically and how Dugin and Spengler are similar in terms of their commentary or their perspective on Russia, both seem to believe that Russians are Eurasian, not European. And if anything, they're more inclined toward the Middle East and Central Asia than they are toward Europe. So that's one interesting point of commonality between the two. Another kind of obvious one, but one worth noting, is that both of them believe that capitalism and socialism are Western imports that do not fit the authentic Russian character. And both obviously have a view of Russia as a culture that is more traditional, more pious, more mystical, and less rationalistic than the West. Spengler probably thinks that's true just because Russia is a lot younger as a civilization. So it's still in its traditional, pious, more mystical phase, right? I think his deterministic model would predict that Russia too will ultimately succumb to the problems of city thinking and the civilizational phase. Anyway, so that's kind of just what I wanted to start with. Is there any kind of initial reaction that you might offer?
Yeah, well, the first thing that comes to mind is I don't know Dugin's work that well. I've read a handful of his books, maybe three or four of them, and certainly not his magnum opus, Pneumakia, which has not been translated into English, although Dugin assures me that it will be at some point, and I'm certain that it will. It's something like 20 volumes, which sounds incredible. His output is so prodigious that
It's unbelievable.
he's if you look at his oeuvre, it's just book after book after book. There's so many of them. And so Pneumakia, from the interview that I had with him, I tried to discuss at least the first two volumes of Pneumakia because he has videos on YouTube explaining each volume.
Mm-hmm.
And so I watched the first two to get the gist of it. And we talked about the first two. It is very Spenglerian in its approach to civilization and culture. He's got this idea that there are definite different civilizations and that each one has its own thing that it's trying to do. Spengler calls it an symbol that it's trying to actualize, like an entelechy, like an Aristotelian entelechy. Civilizations have entelechies that they actualize over time, just like a human life cycle. You have an entelechy when you come into being, you're born. I believe for very specific karmic reasons, you incarnated to perform a specific task. So once that task is performed, whatever it may be, as you get older, you've sort of actualized all the possibilities of the entelechy, and then things just sort of settle down or decline into what Spengler calls a fixed stock of forms that just get repeated as cliches over and over again. We're never going to get great Chinese art again. All we're going to get is Chinese kitsch versions of its art. Same thing with India. They're never going to build another Khajuraho temple again. They're never going to build another Bhubaneswara. That's a once only occurrence. And then so, I mean, one of the telltale signs too, and I think Spengler would agree with this, is precisely, a civilization has actualized all of its possibilities in its entelechy, its Ur symbol, when it devolves into kitsch. And that's all we're getting from it anymore is kitsch. The silly Hindu Indian art that we get of Krishna playing the flute and the goat, the cowgirls dancing around him. And it looks ridiculous. It's just silly. But the same thing has happened to the West as well.
Mm-hmm.
Christianity has declined into kitsch. Nobody takes it seriously who has a brain, who is literate and well read. Turn on any channel on a Sunday morning, and I got stuck in the hospital waiting room one morning on a Sunday, and they had it turned on to some sort of preacher guy. And it's funny because I'm a spiritual person. I believe in God and so forth. So I'm trying to listen to this guy, just trying to find some point that I can sympathize with. And there's nothing. There's nothing. Not one thing. It's kitsch. It's all cliches and stereotypes and kitsch for the masses, the herd. The days when you had St. Thomas Aquinas articulating, right around the year 1300 in the 13th century, the basic worldview of how Christianity stands with respect to the Greco-Roman civilization, especially Aristotle, who had been recently discovered. Those days are over. The days, they ended they started to end in the 19th century. And as we go through my German idealist philosophy course, and we start with Kant, and we move through Fichte, Schelling, and Hegel, and then you get to Schopenhauer. And Schopenhauer is the first of these guys who no longer believes in God. And he's kind of a disguised materialist in many ways. He brings it all, he sort of materializes all these high German metaphysical ideas, and he says, oh, well, that's nonsense. What Hegel's talking about is the world spirit actualizing itself is total nonsense. It's a cosmic will to exist that's just blind. That fit perfectly with the Darwinian paradigm that was just around the corner. He wrote that in 1818. Darwin is 1859, and then Schopenhauer started to become popular because that materialistic worldview. I mean, Schopenhauer's not 100% a materialist. He's like 1 foot in both worlds. But nonetheless, you can see the transition that is transitioning and declining, and Christianity is crumbling. And then Nietzsche's right around the corner to announce the death of God. What he's really announcing is the death of belief in God that is credible. It's no longer credible to the intelligentsia.
Yeah, Charles Taylor has a great line about this. He said that only after 1500, roughly speaking, did not believing in God become a possibility.
Yeah, that's about right.
Ushering in the disenchanted world that we all live in today, at least in the West, although emphatically not in Russia, according to Dugin. A few things you said I'd like to drill down on. So first of all, you mentioned how prolific Dugin is, and I do think that's an important point to make. I was listening to a bit of Michael Millerman's material on Dugin, and Millerman makes a good point, which is that obviously the Western press, and to some extent the Western intelligentsia, wants to define Dugin by a few statements lifted out of context where he's taken hardline stances on current events. But as Michael Millerman puts it, with Dugin, there's the high and the low. His intellectual chops are undeniable. He is unbelievably learned and prolific across an astonishing range of disciplines, regions, and thinkers. So
he even gives me an inferiority complex. That's not easy to do when it comes to the realm of the intellect. But
yeah, John, actually, I thought of you because I was like, this guy is John David Ebert, in the expansiveness of his reading and intellect. But of course, again, the Western media and to some extent intelligentsia, they just lift the political statements he's made about current affairs and basically define him as that. But I think a lot of people do not realize how significant a thinker he is. I mean, the number of lectures he has given and books he has written on, again, the widest range of subjects. I mean, he knows the Western canon far better than the vast majority of Western intellectuals. So that's one point I would make. Going back to, so you said you have not read, how do you pronounce it? Pneumachia?
Pneumachia.
Pneumachia, yeah. So I've not obviously read that either. Don't speak Russian. But I did listen to your conversation with him, and I did find what you guys were talking about interesting. So tell me if this is correct. The main thing that you talked to Dugin about with respect to Pneumakia was his framework for understanding civilization. So if I understand it correctly, he says that every civilization has three elements in different proportion. Those three elements are the Apollonian and the Dionysian, obviously borrowed from Nietzsche's Birth of Tragedy, and then the Cybele, that's Cybele, Cybele.
The goddess Cybele.
Right. The Anatolian mother goddess, right?
Yeah.
So every civilization or society, probably every culture, civilized or pre-civilized, has some combination of the three. But how the three are combined in each society is distinct. And that's what makes each civilization distinct from the rest.
That's
and
sort
further,
of his Symbol, those three and the different proportions that they are in. They're strife. Pneumakia means the strife of the mind.
Of the mind, right? So
it's a strife.
Sort of a battle between ideas, or ideas may not be the best word, but
spiritual tendencies, or whatever you want to call it. Absolutely.
And importantly, the relationship is not static. So the proportion in a society, the proportion of the three could change over time. So for example, we'll get into this in a second, but I think to the extent that materialism or scientific materialism and rationalism has an analog in Apollo, Dionysus, or Cybele, it would be with Cybele. And for example, in Russia, you got this massive injection of the Sibyllian or the materialistic or rationalistic with Peter the Great, a kind of pseudomorphosis, at least an externally imported pseudomorphosis. But that's just one example of how a culture's proportion of these things could change over time. So it's not static. But I think what I wanted to ask you about is I wanted to understand a little better what these three, what do you even call them? Are each of these minds or spiritual? Yeah. So I guess spiritual tendencies, right?
Yeah.
So could you give me your best shot at defining each of these three spiritual tendencies, the Apollonian, the Dionysian, and the Sibyllian? And then I have a follow-up question.
I'll give it a shot. Even though he has borrowed Apollo and Dionysus from Nietzsche, he of course changes their meanings a bit and makes them much more broad. For Nietzsche, he was simply talking about aesthetics. He was talking about Greek art. The Greek temple is pure Apollonian. And in fact, in the Greco-Roman civilization, it's the Apollonian tendency that predominates in that civilization. But for Dugin, the Apollonian tendency isn't just form, as it was for Nietzsche, form, order, discipline, a beautiful Doric column. But it also is a principle of hierarchy, what Deleuze and Guattari would call an arborescent principle. It builds things up vertically in very clear vertical hierarchical arborescent structures and privileges that, as the Greeks did, privileges that structure.
That's helpful.
So whereas Dionysus comes along and likes to destroy all that. Dionysus is a principle of intoxication, as Nietzsche puts it, intoxication, the god of wine, and boundary dissolution. So we have with Apollo the conservation of boundary, and with Dionysus the dissolution of boundaries.
Where would the rhizomatic concept fit into this? Would Dionysus?
The way Dionysus is kind of rhizomatic, it's more. I think of it as a horizontal tendency, and Apollo as a vertical tendency, phallic. It's phallic. Columns are sort of phalluses in a certain sense. They didn't originate that way. They originated in ancient Egypt as bundles of palm fibers bound together like a reed bundle. So it was vegetal in origin, and then the Greeks took it from the Egyptians. But it wasn't ever phallic in intent, but the symbolism turns out to be that way. And then so Dionysus is the principle of boundary dissolution that likes to dissolve those kinds of arborescent structures and brings them down to a kind of horizontal rhizome where we're all, you go into a bar, you sit down with friends, pretty soon everyone's fairly drunk. Now we're all a group bound together rhizomatically. No one is superior to anyone else. Everyone's opinion counts because you're open to, everyone's drunk and having a good time. That's Dionysus. But then, so he adds this third principle from the goddess Cybele as a materialistic principle. And I'm sure there are puns on the word matter, mother, material, all of that. And she was one of the great goddesses in the ancient world, in the Greco-Roman world. They imported her from Anatolia. The Romans, an oracle told the Romans that they wouldn't win the Punic Wars if they did not import her cult from Anatolia and bring it in, because Rome was way too Apollonian, way too masculine, way too phallic, just too much male, male, male. And mostly, as Bachofen pointed out, who was the guy who discovered in the 19th century Mother Right, that there were earlier matriarchies behind these patriarchal cultures. So they needed to bring in the sacred stone. She was associated with the sacred stone, Cybele. So they imported it. They followed the oracle's advice, and they won. But the other thing about to take into account with Cybele is that famously her cult is known that the priests are self-castrated. They've cut off their genitals and offered them to the goddess. So they're eunuchs. At least I'm sure the inner group was. I doubt that was a very common thing for the followers of Cybele. Chopping off one's penis does not sound like that great of a good time, even with a few beers involved. No. So it's interesting though that Dugin does add this female element that he feels is missing in Nietzsche, and Nietzsche's a bit weak on the female. Women didn't like him. He had to go to prostitutes. He never married. So the female principle is weak in his set of ideas. So I like that Dugin adds it in. But now there's this strife between these three principles, and one will predominate, as the Apollonian predominated in the classical world.
So we could say, just to be very crude, Apollo maps onto masculine, and Cybelean maps onto the feminine.
Yeah.
So help me understand this. I mean, one thing that's weird.
Dionysus, I should point out, lest I get flack from classicists, that Dionysus is associated with the phallus too, and even more so than Apollo, because the Dionysus cults were all women, and they would carry huge phalluses. They would make clay phalluses as part of their cult, and they would carry those with them. So Dionysus was very much not just associated with wine, but also with sexuality as well, which is another form of boundary dissolution. And it was primarily a cult of women.
What's weird, though, to me, and help me understand this, is that some of the concepts associated with the Dionysian in Dugin's framework, that is intoxication, boundary dissolution, lack of hierarchy, those things seem to me to have more connection to the archetypal feminine than materialism does. Indeed, materialism actually is a fairly male and kind of autistic male contribution. When I think of hardcore materialists, there are relatively few women in those ranks, and the women who are in those ranks are pretty masculine in terms of their personality. I'm
going to get myself in trouble here, but you can edit this out. I think of women as materialists. Every woman I have been with has been primarily concerned with stuff, getting stuff, couches and posters and antiques and stuff. They always want stuff. I don't care about stuff. You look at the whole place is blank. I don't have stuff. And women, it seems to me, are inveterate materialists.
Oh, okay, hold on. I think I understand the source of the confusion. I'm referring to scientific materialism. Is Dugin's Cybelean more about materialism and the sort of consumerist capitalist? Oh,
yes.
That's really helpful.
Because he says that right now the West is characterized by a predominance of the Cybelean elements. And so Cybele has won at this point over Dionysus for the West.
That makes sense to me now, because I was thinking he meant scientific materialism has won in the West, which is also true. I just thought that's not at all a feminine thing, but the materialism I can see more. I mean, what you just said about women, it's classic. I mean, there's tons of comedy bits about the same thing. Like Chris Rock says that men can't move backward sexually and women can't move backward in terms of lifestyle. And Dave Chappelle talks about how if a guy could woo a woman in a cardboard box, he wouldn't have a house. He has a house so that a woman will want to hang out with him. He has a nice car so that
there's
a woman will want to get into it.
there's no such thing as free sex. I'm sorry, there's not. You can go to a prostitute like Nietzsche did and make it bald and evident, or you can marry and do this as I did, do the same thing, but you're still paying for it one way or another. I go into Walmart on Fridays on occasion. I had to go this morning to get some winter stuff, space heaters and so forth. Um, and it's all women in there spending their husbands' paychecks. That's what they're
Yeah.
doing. They're in there
Yeah.
on Fridays, and that's when it is most crowded in Walmart on Fridays because the women are in there spending their husbands' paychecks.
Yeah.
So there's no such thing as free sex.
That's really helpful, actually. So the materialism associated with Symbolism is the kind of consumer capitalist materialism, the obsession with stuff, or the preoccupation with having things, having nice things, having a nice lifestyle. Okay. And just to concretize this a little bit, I know that Dugin thinks, so if we take Russia, for example, he thinks that the Russian state is its Apollonian element, hierarchical, masculine.
Yes.
And then the Russian people, or the masses, are the Dionysian element.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure what exactly he means there, but I have heard him say that. And then he thinks that there's been this materialistic or civilian import from the West in the form of capitalism and development, basically, right? Railroads, machines, industrialization, right? So that's kind of how he breaks it down in Russia. That's the balance of the three elements in Russia. I think in the West, I think I heard him say, or maybe you say, that he regards Plato as very Apollonian. Heidegger, I know what I wanted to ask you. Before I say what I was going to say about the West, do you think it's accurate to say that the Dionysian is kind of a middle ground between the Apollonian and the civilian? Does it?
It kind of is a middle ground. Yeah. Yeah.
I don't know how exactly.
That's something about Heidegger that I forgot now, but I remember being startled by it. Did he say that Heidegger was Dionysian?
I think so. Right. He said, I think
that
he says,
surprised me. I remember that surprised me.
It would make a little more sense to me if Dionysian was kind of a middle ground somehow between Apollonian and Sibyllian, because Plato is an idealist. And then on the other end of the spectrum, you have materialist, although not materialist in the consumer materialism sense, materialism in the ontological sense. So Plato is sort of an idealist. And then as you get into the 19th and 20th centuries in the West, scientific materialism predominates. Heidegger is sort of in the middle of those two traditions, right?
Yes, but very much reacting against the scientific mentality, the Sibyllian scientific mentality. He spends most of his career railing against science, which is one of the things that appeals to me about him. And with an intellect of that nature, who can't stand mathematics, astonishes me, especially since his teacher Husserl was a mathematician. Although I think that psychologically that was bound up together with his rebellion against the master Husserl as a mathematician. And so Heidegger sort of turns the world upside down, whereas Husserl says, let's bracket the natural attitude, which is just the naive way that the average person thinks about the world. Let's bracket that and set it aside, and let's look at phenomenology, the phenomenology of consciousness and how it really works. It's this, and then it becomes this very abstract thing, whereas Heidegger comes in and turns that upside down and says, well, no, let's bring the natural attitude back. That's Dasein. That's average, ordinary, everyday experience. That's what I'm interested in. That every person has a pre-philosophical understanding of what it is that they're supposed to do, and they just do it. And as they do it, society works, it functions. So everyone knows what they're doing and what they're supposed to do, and they just do it. That's the natural attitude. So his rebellion against mathematics, part of that is he just sees it as abstract, as unnatural, and as hostile to specific world horizons. That's the main thing, because anytime you're doing math, you're taking some entity or something and putting it into a mathematical XYZ phase space and analyzing it for its objective properties. So you're de-worlding it. You remove the entity, person, object, whatever it is, from the context of its world horizon. So everything for Heidegger is about re-embedding the self, back into the
Mhm.
world. For him, Dasein means self plus world.
Actually, this might segue nicely into a discussion of Dugin's critique of the West and his proposed alternative to Western modernity, because Heidegger is absolutely essential for Dugin, and more specifically, Heidegger's critique of Descartes, or at least his implied critique of Descartes. So maybe let me say a few words about this and then have you respond. So just very superficially, Dugin has this fourth political theory, right? And his fourth political theory, it's fourth because it's after communism, fascism, and liberalism, right? And communism, fascism, and liberalism, in Dugin's view, the common denominator of all three is Western modernity, which he sometimes defines as being closely related to the Cartesian self. And to be clear, and this is one way in which Dugin is similar to Spengler. Dugin does not criticize the West for its commitment to communism or fascism or liberalism in different places at different times. I don't think, or at least I don't think that's his central critique. His central critique of the West is that all three of these isms, all three of these political ideologies, wanted to be universal and wanted to impose themselves outside of the West on the entire world. And Dugin is explicitly, pointedly anti-universalist. He wants the West to be the West, but he also wants Russia to be Russia, and he does not want the West interfering with that. But that said, I think that his fourth political theory, I think his fourth political theory, part of what he's trying to do is create a political theory that is not universalistic, that is anti-universalistic, right? And my sense is that he uses Heidegger to do that. He thinks that the Cartesian self, the Cartesian subject, is foundational to Western modernity, and that to provide a fourth political theory, he has to deconstruct the Cartesian subject and replace it with something new. And I think he uses Heidegger for that purpose. And he even updates Heidegger because I think he thinks that Heidegger believed that Dasein was universalistic or was universal. In other words, I've heard Dugin criticize Heidegger for thinking that his own concept of Dasein was universal, whereas Dugin thinks that there are specific Daseins for every civilization.
The reason that I got the interview with Dugin was because he liked a talk that I gave. We were part of the same study group, some study group in England, organized by this very nice young man. He was bringing in academics and all kinds. Dugin just happened to be a member of the group, and he caught my lecture on the different Daseins of the civilizations.
Ah.
So what I did was combine Spengler with Rudolf Steiner and Heidegger. And I began the lecture by pointing out, I said, when people think of Dasein, especially as Heidegger articulated it in Being and Time, they think there's just one universal Dasein. And indeed, it does come across that way. He's talking about the human way of being in the world. It means you're part of a particular place and time. You're in a particular profession. You're doing everything's very particular things. That's Dasein, and it comes across as universal. However, I remember coming across a passage that drove me crazy because I can't find where it was, but I have a memory of it, where on one page, after reading Spengler, and Heidegger read Spengler early on and liked him, he wrote this comment, the different Daseins of the civilizations, that's another topic. Different Daseins. So there's Daseins plural as well. And that's only like, it's just one reference on one page somewhere.
Fascinating.
I never forgot that. And when I thought about it, I thought about it. He's thinking of the different Daseins the way Spengler was thinking of the different Earth symbols.
Earth symbols, right.
So I riffed on that, and I went into this thing that Dugin liked very much because it's multipolar, not unipolar. And I went in and I talked about the different Daseins / Earth symbols of the different civilizations. I also added a spiritual component with Rudolf Steiner's angels, each angel presiding over a different civilization, because the angels have also the classical hierarchy of the angels that Rudolf Steiner uses. Each one has a very specific function, and I see those classical angels, even though there are only 7 of them, and there's 9 civilizations to cover, but nonetheless, they fit pretty well with each of the civilizations. So he liked that. He liked the appeal to spirituality. He is Orthodox Christian, so obviously he believes in angels. So everything sort of meshed together in that lecture, and he loved it. And then so when I asked him for an interview, he said, "Well, absolutely, of course, you can interview me, absolutely."
That's
I asked him,
awesome.
and I said, "Have you read Oswald Spengler?" And he said, "Yes, of course I have. Yeah, absolutely." And then after the assassination attempt, of course, there's, because I wanted to do a series of conversations with him on Pneumakia and just go through each of all the volumes. That was the plan, and he agreed to it. But not after the assassination attempt. There's just no way to communicate with him.
Well, okay, first of all, John, that is fascinating. So maybe I misunderstood Dugin though. I thought in the interview I heard, and I can't remember where I heard this interview, that he was criticizing Heidegger for his universality. But what you're telling me is that you gave a lecture where one of your main points was that Heidegger did not think Dasein was a single universal thing, a unipolar thing. And Dugin liked that.
Maybe he had never thought of that. Maybe he had never come across that page.
Maybe he got the idea from you. Actually,
so maybe it changed his perception of Heidegger, which is what I was hoping it would do. And I was hoping that he would be in the audience, because the guy organizing said, so sometimes he shows up, sometimes he doesn't. So I was hoping he'd be in the audience, but he was.
Staying on this issue of Dugin's critique of the West. So maybe his most important critique is just that the West is so universalistic in its pretensions, whether it's communism or fascism or liberalism. It has this sense that the whole world should be like the West. And I think that may be fundamentally, or the most important thing that Dugin objects to. He doesn't mind the West being the West. What he minds is the West telling Russia how to be. And his message to the West is, be yourself, but if you try to impose your ways on us, expect to encounter stiff resistance. And of course, this is where his whole take on Ukraine comes in. I mean, he thinks that NATO's various activities in Eastern Europe and beyond represent one in a long line of Western encroachments on the Russian empire or sphere of influence, and he rejects it and wants to resist it. And I liked in your conversation that he ultimately agreed that boundary act was a good concept to use to describe what Russia is doing with respect to Ukraine. But one thing that I did not quite get, and maybe you can shed some light here, is, first of all, totalitarianism. Dugin repeatedly emphasizes that all three of these Western isms, communism, fascism, and liberalism, have become totalitarian. And that is an utterly uncontroversial point with respect to communism, pretty uncontroversial with respect to fascism, although the fascist regimes were not as totalitarian as the communist regimes. They were still arguably totalitarian. And increasingly in the West today, we're seeing a new kind of totalitarianism that Dugin calls liberal totalitarianism, because he thinks liberalism is the reigning ideology in the West today. And one would have to be blind not to notice the totalitarian tendencies among the ruling classes in the West today, especially maybe in the US, but elsewhere. But one thing that's not totally clear to me is, it seems like Dugin's own philosophy and his kind of postmodernism and his cultural relativism with respect to values would preclude him from condemning the West for being internally totalitarian. Again, if the West is totalitarian in the sense that it's requiring the whole world to be like it and enforcing it, okay, fine. But to the extent that it's totalitarian internally, to the extent, for example, that the West is banning Dugin's books internally, I don't see how Dugin could object to that. And maybe he wouldn't, but sometimes I've heard him complain about Amazon censoring him, right? And
I couldn't find hardly any of his books on Amazon when I decided to sit down and read, except for one that was obviously a caricature of him. It's called "The West Must Be Destroyed,"
right,
which supposedly was a quote, and maybe he did utter it at some point, but again, taken out of context. And I read that book. That was the first book that I read, and it was just all this polemic against how evil he is, and how he hates the West and wishes that it would be destroyed, and all this garbage that has no relation to reality whatsoever. The fact of the matter is, and I think we should state this very clearly, Dugin loves the West. He
Mhm.
loves the West, but he recognizes that it's other with a capital O. It's other, and as you say, he doesn't want it dictating to Russia how its Dasein should be. The Western Dasein is fine in and of itself, and it was clear from that interview. And I was very surprised how much he loved American pop.
Right.
He was talking about American popular culture and trashy drive-in B movies that he loved. That
And
took me by
and
surprise.
he showed almost more sympathy for the great American philosophical strain of pragmatism than you did.
Yeah, yeah, I think so by far. So no, he loves the West, and let's face it, these ideas are from the West, from Nietzsche. You know, from he's Heidegger. He's taken all kinds of ideas from Western thinkers and
Hmm.
synthesized them in his own way. So perhaps the pseudomorphosis is still going on in Russia. I believe it is on an intellectual level here. And I think if we were to look at Spengler's timelines and go to the beginning of where is Russia at right now, I think Dugin would slot in with where we were at with somebody like St. Thomas Aquinas,
Mm,
an early scholastic, universally learned
mm.
thinker who is dealing with the pseudomorphosis in that case of Aristotle.
That's a
And
great point. Just as Aquinas integrated the Aristotelian corpus with the Judeo-Christian corpus, Dugin is integrating, right. So just as Aquinas was integrating the arguably somewhat alien Aristotelian corpus with the indigenous Judeo-Christian corpus, Dugin is integrating the alien
Heidegger,
Western,
Spengler,
right.
yeah,
Hmm.
exactly. And
Hmm.
all his favorite. I've seen a list somewhere. He had a list on a website, one of his documents, I forget what it was, of all the thinkers that he admires, and most of them were Western.
Mm,
Most There was a whole list: Mircea Eliade, Carl Jung,
right.
all these things that took me by surprise. I was like, this guy is obviously enamored with Western thought. There's no question about it. But the media, of course, as they do with everything, flatten everything out into two-dimensional cliches and caricatures that have nothing to do. This does not correspond to reality at all.
Do you have any comments on what I said about totalitarianism or any insights there? Because again, he seems to be very critical of totalitarianism, but I can't tell if part of what he means by totalitarianism. Well, I mean, again, he's very hesitant to. Okay, I think here's the problem. Dugin, speaking from his own Russian perspective, does have critiques of the West. He would not argue that those critiques are universalistic, and he would not expect the West to accept his critiques. Nevertheless, he has them. So maybe that's an important point to make. For example, I think that his view is that the West is sort of like the devil figure in the sense that, the devil turned his back on God and said, no, with my will and my intellect, I can know everything I need to know without your help. And that's, in a sense, what the West did, killing God and just becoming scientifically materialist. I think from his perspective, from his Russian perspective, that he would not universalize, that would be his critique of the West. And maybe when he criticizes totalitarianism in the West, he also just means it from his kind of provincial Russian perspective. That I'm kind of thinking out loud here and trying to understand, like when he criticizes totalitarianism, it's not clear to me whether he's talking about the desire to force everyone to accept Western ideas, or if he's actually objecting to internal totalitarianism in the West, because I think that's a harder argument for him to make, given that he gives each culture so much discretion to figure out how exactly it wants to organize itself.
Yeah, that's a tangled topic, and I don't know him well enough to comment on that.
Yeah,
I will say this though,
yeah.
with respect to him loving the West and being critical of it, I can't think of a single thinker that I love that I'm not critical of. Whether it's Nietzsche, Spengler, Schopenhauer, I find faults with all of them. But nonetheless, that's my pantheon. Those are my Homeric gods, let's say. But they all have things that I disagree with, and I think it's possible. Thomas Mann, the German novelist who was writing around 1900 down to about 1950. He left Germany when the Nazis took power, moved to Los Angeles, then moved back after they were out of power. Um, he came up with this idea that he called, derived from Nietzsche, that he called erotic irony. And he says, and he's talking about person to person relationships here. Um, and he says that what erotic irony is that you, the right word hurts.
Mm,
So when you criticize someone and you strike a nerve, that hurts. But at the same time, if there's love involved, compassion, then it becomes erotic irony. So it's a criticism of someone at the same time that it does not exclude loving the person. Uh, I can think of a million things about my brother that are wrong with him, but I love the guy. I would never want to be without him ever in a million years. You know, it's kind of like that. And I think that Dugin's attitude to the West is something similar to that. But the West just keeps caricaturizing it and taking the criticisms as though that were the only thing that mattered. And it isn't, because his attitude is very complex.
Yeah, and of course, a lot of his critique of the West is drawn from Western thinkers critiquing the West, as you point out, right? Yeah.
Such as Nietzsche.
Yeah, and Heidegger, probably most importantly. I mean, actually, since you're such an expert on Heidegger, maybe we could turn to that, because so Dugin's fourth political theory, again, he's trying to create a new political theory after communism, fascism, and liberalism, the fourth political theory. Okay, well, what is it? Now, I've heard him describe it in a few ways. He says that one really interesting way that he puts it is it's a mixture of the pre-modern, anti-modern, counter-modern critiques of modernity, and the postmodern critiques of modernity. So he's like encircling modernity from the future and from the past. But the point is he's explicitly anti-modern, more specifically, explicitly anti-liberal, which is interesting for Westerners to hear. And by the way, anti-liberalism is becoming more prominent, especially on the right wing in the Western world, including in the United States. In fact, it seems like all of the energy on the activist and the intellectual right now is on the anti-liberal side, not defending the liberal order, but questioning the liberal order. So Dugin has that in common with a lot of people on the dissident right in America today. So he's anti-modern, more specifically, he's anti-liberal, which is interesting from a Western point of view. He's anti-communist, which is important because a lot of people think that Putin is a nostalgist for the communist era, and in some sense he is. Yeah, in some, I mean, Putin is a nostalgist for Russia. He's a nostalgist for the Russian Imperium.
Yeah,
that's what
he's kind of a modernized czar.
Right.
The comparison is pretty accurate. He brings back the church and the czar's relationship with the patriarch as the head of the church. He has a very cozy relationship with who is it? Kirill, the current patriarch.
Kirill or something. Yeah.
Kirill.
Yeah.
Yeah. So he's bringing back that whole structure that disintegrated under Nicholas, the last Tsar, at the end of World War One. He's bringing that back in disguised form because of the pseudomorphosis of modernization and capitalism and all of these surface structures
and communism.
Yeah, dance over that. But he wants to bring back the soul of Russia, the original pious Russia. That belief in God is taken for granted. The church is taken for granted. Its rulership and its partnership with the czar, all that's taken for granted. And both Putin and Dugin want that.
Right. And when Putin says that the collapse of the Soviet Union was the greatest geopolitical catastrophe, it's very specifically the greatest geopolitical catastrophe, not the greatest ideological catastrophe. Basically, I heard Millerman put it this way: the collapse of the Soviet Union represented a kind of heart attack for the Russian Empire.
Yep.
The borders have been expanding and contracting for hundreds of years, and probably the single most significant contraction was the collapse of the Soviet Union. And again,
they lost 14 countries?
Or, yeah. They lost all the Baltic states.
Yeah.
Right. They lost Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania. They lost Belarus. They lost Ukraine. They lost Moldova. They lost all the Central Asian republics. They lost they lost Georgia, Armenia, Azerbaijan.
Yeah, you're right. That's a major geopolitical contraction.
No, but they also lost Eastern Europe. I mean, Eastern Europe was solidly. I mean, they lost East Germany, the Czech Republic, Czechoslovakia, Poland, to some extent Yugoslavia, Romania. I mean, they lost a ton. So when Putin says that it was the greatest geopolitical catastrophe, he's speaking as a Russian imperialist and a Russian nationalist, not as a nostalgist for communism. And so anyway, the point is he's anti-modern, meaning he's anti-liberal, anti-communist, so he's not communist, and anti-fascist. I think that may be the most interesting one because
some people do
regard him as a fascist.
As fascist,
and I would say
adjective applied to him quite a bit.
And I would say not without any reason, because what he substitutes in the place of fascism is pretty subtle. Because if the centerpiece of the liberal order is the individual, and the centerpiece of the communist order is the class, so individual class, the proletariat, the centerpiece of the fascist order is something like the nation or the race. And for Dugin, the centerpiece should be the people, but the people is very similar to the nation or the race. Now he distinguishes them because the nation, he says, is a modern concept. You know, the nation state only came into existence in the second half of the second millennium AD. And so he distinguishes the people from the nation and thinks the nation is a modern category and to be discarded. And he wants to go back to something that's a little older, like the people. But in any case, he's very pointedly anti-fascist. I think in the fourth political theory, he goes into great detail about why, making clear that for him, again, the nation state is a modern construction that he rejects. And furthermore, that he's very, again, anti-chauvinistic. And fascists were very chauvinistic, right? Dugin is very anti-racist. He does not think one race is better than another. He doesn't think one class is better than another. He doesn't think one set of values is better than another. And so he rejects that aspect of fascism too. But again, his positive vision for Russia, it's a kind of nationalism, right? Or it's a kind of, it's an emphasis on the nation in a sense.
What I was going to say is I heard him say a rather astonishing statement. I don't think it was in our interview. It was elsewhere, where he is for centralized authority. The patriarch and and Putin. He is definitely for centralized authority, and he says the reason for that is that the Russian soul is so chaotic. It has to have an external force imposed on it. Otherwise, it's just chaos and anarchy. So I find that interesting.
No, he said that to you, John. That was in his interview with you.
Interview? Okay, yeah.
Right, because that's when he was going through the Apollonian, Dionysian, and Sibyllian in Russia. And he said, right, the state is Apollonian. And the reason we need the Apollonian state in Russia is that we're totally disordered as a people.
Right. So that was funny.
It is really funny. It is really funny. And of course, Dostoevsky, his characters and Dostoevsky's own life, it's almost like the embodiment of that aspect of the Russian character, dissolute.
Dostoevsky, as Spengler says, is like the a writer of the Gospels of Russia. His texts are like early Russian Gospels.
Help me understand something, John. So, I mean, I think I have a vague general understanding of why Descartes is so important to modernity, because he's sort of responsible for creating the subject-object distinction, which is so fundamental that no one even questions it, including me, usually. I mean, I find that distinction inestimably useful every day when I'm thinking about things. And, I've not read Dugin at all. I've only listened to things, but he's anti-modern, which means anti-liberal, anti-communist, anti-fascist. When he is describing the philosophical foundations of modernity, he often refers to Descartes and the Cartesian subject. And then he, as we've discussed, in his fourth political theory, deconstructs that mainly by using Heidegger's deconstruction of that. I was wondering, do you feel like you have a handle on what that's all about, the Cartesian subject, and how Heidegger deconstructed it? I mean, you said a few things before, but if you could go into a little more detail about what that even means, it would help us understand Dugin, because Dugin, that's totally central for him.
That's what we're studying in my school right now with the history of German idealist philosophy. We started with Aquinas, and we went through Aquinas to Descartes, because normally what happens is you start with Descartes. He's regarded as the father of modern philosophy. And even the German idealists were referring to him that way, Schopenhauer and others. But I don't think that you can understand what Descartes is reacting against without understanding Aquinas as the leading figure of the scholastics. I mean, you could pick others, but Aquinas is the most universally learned, the most encyclopedically learned. And Descartes is reacting against that. And one of the things that he's doing, and it's a kind of hidden thing, is that he's getting us out of the mind of God. Because the problem with the medieval idea is that everything takes place within the mind of God. The Platonic ideas are in the mind of God. Nothing is true unless it's one of God's thoughts. That's Aquinas. And so Descartes wants to get us out of that and draw a membrane around the self. There's this thing called the self, the cogito, the subject, that thinks its own thoughts. It doesn't need God to think thoughts for it, even though he does end up proving the existence of God by resurrecting the ontological argument. But I think that's just baggage left over from the Middle Ages. the key thing about Descartes is this discovery of the self. It's almost like a transcendental bubble that's just sort of floating in a phase space that Heidegger would call Vorhandenheit. So Heidegger makes this distinction in Being and Time, where he's talking about different understandings of being. And he says that the West's understanding of being since Descartes has been this idea of Vorhandenheit, where you take an object or an entity and you put it into Cartesian phase space and pull all the objective properties out of it so we can all agree on it and form science out of that. But in the process, it does damage to the entity because it deworlds the entity, removes it from its context. So the West has had this transcendental self, the strong subject, as Peter Sloterdijk calls it, ever since Descartes, this incredibly strong self that with Descartes saying, I think, therefore I am, it sounds trivial on the surface of it, but it isn't, because he's saying, I think, not God, not angels. I am the one doing the thinking here. And I can create my own world based on finding what it is that I'm clear and distinctly certain about. And so the subject begins right there with Western philosophy. We're out of the mind of God. God is already starting to fade over the horizon a bit there. This is like 1630. And then so as you go through the history of Western philosophy and you get to the Germans, the German idealists, starting with Kant, Kant still has this sense of the subject. He gives it a fancy term, the transcendental unity of apperception is his fancy term for the self, the subject that perceives in the outer world has to conform to the subject's categories, its a priori categories, which it imposes on the outer world. And that continues through into Fichte, whom I don't particularly care for, most people don't, but he does represent the apotheosis of the subject. For Fichte, the subject is all that there is. It's the only thing that matters. The self posits the self. A is equal to A, and the self is primary, and the self generates the not self. He almost dismisses the whole outer world just simply by calling it the not self. So you have the self and the not self, but it's really the self that's doing the positing, that's the important thing. So we get this floating transcendental bubble that goes all the way down to Husserl. And with Heidegger, then, he takes that self and he says, what happened to the world that the self belonged in? That's Dasein. Put the self back into the ground of a particular world horizon. And now we have the self plus world. So in a way, Heidegger, although I think inadvertently, represents the beginnings of the slide down into postmodernism, whereby in postmodernism, the subject, there is no subject. It's the Deleuze and Guattari, Derrida, they all dismantle the subject and pull it apart. There is no subject.
Would it be accurate in your view to summarize this aspect of Heidegger's critique of Descartes by saying that in Heidegger's view, the subject depends on the object depends on the subject, neither the subject nor the object can exist without the other. Therefore, it's better not to distinguish them and instead to have a single concept that sort of combines them?
Let me put it this way. Okay, hold on. Let me put it this way. For Heidegger, what he does is he sort of romanticizes the Greek understanding of being, especially the pre-Socratic understanding of being as physis, whereby entities manifest themselves, they unconceal themselves, they flash forth, and they disappear mysteriously. So the whole thing is this mystical phenomenon, but there is not much of a human subject there. It's the autonomy is out there. And I think what Heidegger is doing is retrieving the autonomy of the entity out there and de-escalating the priority of the subject, which with the German thinkers, had already cycled through it. So he's giving quite a great deal of autonomy to the entity that we encounter in what he calls the clearing, which is of course a forest metaphor, but it means the space of encounter between entities in which things are unconcealed.
That we are thrown into.
And entities unconceal themselves to us. We don't dig them up out of the ground. They come to us. That's where the autonomy on the entity is. And they unconceal aspects of themselves from different angles of truth. And so there is no truth for Heidegger in terms of a binarity of true or false, as for Hegel, for instance, something's either true or it isn't. And if it's true, it matches the idea, the ultimate, the absolute. Not so for Heidegger, because when an entity unconceals itself, certain sides of it are visible, but then other sides fall off the radar. So we never get the full picture of it. So once again, here we're on the way down to postmodernity, with that we can no longer say that there are absolute truths. There are only degrees of reality, depending on which game you want to play. Hermeneutics with Gadamer in Truth and Method, that's a whole different truth game there. And Gadamer was, by the way, one of Heidegger's pupils. But for Gadamer does something interesting. He does a couple of interesting things in that book, Truth and Method, which I think came out right around 1960, where he talks about the text. And he says, when we go back and we read Greek texts, let's say we read Herodotus, and we read it and we write about it, and we're getting an objective view of what Herodotus said. He says, we're not getting anything of the sort. There's no text in itself, because we're looking at that text colored by the biases of the present. So there is no text in itself. So already the text has slipped off. It's become slippery now, even with a pupil of Heidegger. So there is a direct lineage between Heidegger and Gadamer, and then the French Pomo thinkers. Yeah.
And of course, the very method that Dugin and Spengler employ shows that they think in those terms, because they know that they have to deeply immerse themselves in the art and the mysticism and the religion, and obviously the literature and the philosophy and everything else of a culture, in order to remotely understand it. They can't just read a few texts about some alien culture and expect to understand it. Like, they really have to shed, they have to get out of the way, right? They have to and really understand the culture on its own terms. And I know that Dugin very explicitly models his approach on the anthropological approach of Franz Boas and Claude Levi-Strauss.
Mythology figures very strongly in his worldview. Mythology, spirituality, mysticism. That's why I liked Mircea Eliade and Carl Jung, and guys like that. I'm forgetting the name of the guy that he is it Julius Evola? That he likes?
Evola, yeah.
That he likes, whom I have not read. But.
It's funny because, again, so if liberalism is the individual, communism is the class, fascism is the nation, what is the thing for Dugin's fourth political theory? I think he says Dasein. I was listening to his conversation on the Stoa from 2 years ago, and I think he says that for him it's Dasein. So individual, class, nation, he rejects those. And he offers Dasein. And of course, there are many Daseins. Each civilization has its Dasein.
Yes, and with regard to the individual, I mean, he says that Russia you have to consider as landlocked. It's in the middle, surrounded by these Western thalassocracies, such as the UK and America in particular, these seagoing peoples, whereas Russia is primarily landlocked, which was why St. Petersburg was built, so they could have a port to bring goods in, but otherwise it's landlocked, and it's landlocked. But the position of the individual, because it's in between Asia on the one hand and Europe on the other, the position of the individual for Dugin is that Russia is more individualistic than Asia, but not as individualistic as the West, because it literally is in between both. And so the Eurasian mentality is not based on the I, it's based on a we, on a definite we. He's said that.
Yeah, and actually, I do think he says Dasein is his equivalent of individual, class, nation, but I also think he's used the term the people. Yeah. So it's either Dasein or the people, but the people for him very emphatically is not the nation or the race or the state, all of which are associated with fascism. Instead, he defined the people as, quote, a community of destiny sharing the same existential identity. Viewers might find this interesting. I just see a couple of my notes on why at least Dugin thinks that he's not a fascist. He says that, first of all, totalitarianism is a modern phenomenon, and he takes that idea from Hannah Arendt, and of course he's an anti-modernist, Dugin.
Another pupil of Heidegger, by the way.
Oh, right. And Paramore, correct?
Yeah, and concubine, yeah,
Yeah.
cheated on his wife.
I think Dugin said that either fascism broadly or totalitarianism specifically is based on the same alienation that other modern political ideologies are based on. He's very explicitly anti-racist and anti-chauvinistic, but he also, again, thinks that fascism is a modern phenomenon because of the nation state, because of the notion of citizenship, which is integral to the definition of nation state, and also because it is totalitarian, which I guess is also a modern phenomenon, although I don't know exactly. I haven't thought about that or read enough Hannah Arendt to know exactly what makes totalitarianism a modern phenomenon. But I can see how it might be related to alienation, because there might be a greater need on the part of the population for totalitarianism from the top if there's disconnection and anomie and alienation in the society. So maybe that's part of what is meant there. Oh, and interestingly, yeah, so Dugin is against the nation state. So interestingly, he rejects the nationalist backlash to globalism. That was interesting to hear, because you might expect Dugin to support Brexit and support Trump, who were making kind of pro-nation state appeals in the face of the globalist neoliberal order. But I think Dugin thinks that going back to the nation state would not be good, and it would basically just be shifting the West from liberalism closer to fascism. But he rejects all of it and wants to replace it with his new thing. Please,
the nation state is disintegrating anyway. Yeah. It is a Western construction, and it's interesting if you look at Spengler's sort of genealogy of different policies. He says that each one of the civilizations also has its own way of organizing its communities. With the Greeks, we have the polis, which is a city-state that is based on an optically visual place that you can see. It's not a big place. Theoretically, you go to the top of a hill and you can see the whole polis. That's the near Apollonian aspect of the Greco-Roman world, where he says with the Magian civilization, the Judeo-Christian Islamic civilization, it's the community, the group that is held together by a consensus. So there's no tie to a particular landscape or soil. It's consensus. We believe, and our belief, because we all believe the same thing, whatever the group is, Nestorian Christianity, Manichaeans, whatever the group is, they're bound together by consensus, because that means that the spirit, the pneuma, has come down and dwelt amongst us and is binding us together mystically, almost like a mystical spiritual glue. And then for the West, it's the nation state, which is very geographical, very territorial, and much larger than either one of those conceptions. So we have the nation state coming in out of feudalism, pretty much in the 17th century, during the Baroque, when it becomes a big deal. And then that's disintegrating now. So what's interesting is, so what is the polis for Russia going to be? And I don't know, but it'll be different. But
I think he does kind of want to go back to a pre-modern definition of community, or a pre-modern equivalent of individual, class, or nation, because he made the point that I think I heard him say in the Stoa conversation that the nation is a bourgeois concept that appeared at the end of the Middle Ages and replaced older concepts like the estates, the church, the empire, the peasant community.
It's definitely a bourgeois mercantile construction. Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah.
And I think he wants to go back to the pre-modern
of the third estate, whereas the Middle Ages, you get the first two estates, the priesthood and the nobility. But with the nation state, because the burghers are rising, and they're so powerful because with capitalism, they're making so much money off of trade. What Quigley says is an instrument of expansion that replaced feudalism was commercial capitalism, where they're going around to India and they're getting all these goods from India, and some from China perhaps, but mostly from India. They're getting all kinds of stuff, rosewood and ambergris and all kinds of stuff, and they're making lots of money off of this. Fernand Braudel, by the way, in his huge 3-volume history of capitalism, which I read the first 2 volumes and then ran out of gas. I couldn't get to the third one. But he traces the rise of shops and stores and commercial centers. And they really do come in the starting in the shortly after the Renaissance. But the 17th century is the apogee of the
Yeah.
world of the burghers with the aristocrats. Carl Schmitt, who is often invoked by the left, funnily enough, because unlike Spengler, who merely flirted with the Nazis briefly, or Heidegger, who was a Nazi for a year in 1933, Schmitt remained a Nazi unapologetically to the end. And the left likes him. They quote him. You can't read Giorgio Agamben without understanding Carl Schmitt, which is why I went to go read him. And so in The Nomos of the Earth, which is, I think, a masterpiece, it's one of his best books, where he writes it right after the end of World War II, where he's talking about we have these three periods in the West where we have this medieval period, this Holy Roman imperial period that's governed by the papacy.
Mm-hmm.
And so everything is tied to this universal church world mentality. But then after that, we get what he calls the Jus Publicum Europaeum, JPE for short, which is a balance of power between nation states that starts in the 17th century, whereby it is perfectly legal to declare war on another state. Germany can declare war on France all at once. Other nations may or may not be involved. There may be alliances, but there is a balance of power. And there is such a thing, which is a startling concept, that Schmitt calls civilized warfare.
Right. Oh,
During,
yeah.
during this kind of mutual respect that each of these nations have for each other, even while going to war against each other, there's no such thing as an annihilation war where you go in and you commit genocide and you just wipe out civilians. For the most part, civilians are treated decently. When Napoleon's troops go into Weimar or places in and around, like where Goethe was living, he was in Weimar, the troops were mostly pretty respectful. Houses had to billet them, let them come in, spend the night, eat food. But generally, rapes were few and far between, and they were pretty civil to the civilians. So Schmitt says that the JPE was an era of civilized warfare that ended with World War One, and with World War One, after World War One is over, which was an annihilation war, it introduced the concept of annihilating the enemy, wiping Germany off the map. So he
Right.
had respect for Germany, and he says Kaiser Wilhelm was the first to be tried for war crimes. So war at that point was made for the first time illegal, the first time in history. So there is no longer, he says, a balance of power anymore. And then it shifts, of course, into the bipolar world with Russia and these larger. Oh, speaking of an interesting sequel to the nation state, might be his idea of what he calls a Grossraum, a great space. And he says a great space is transnational. He says the Western Hemisphere is the American Grossraum, consolidated by the Monroe Doctrine. Any hostilities, in the Western Hemisphere is considered to be an attack on America in the Western Hemisphere. And then there's the Russian Grossraum. He calls it a Grossraum as well. So we have these Grossräume that now come in that are transnational. They're very large entities. And he says after World War II, there's only two of them. They're the Russian Grossraum and the American Grossraum. So maybe the Grossraum is the replacement for the nation state. I don't know. I think it's an interesting idea to consider these wars between the hemispheres.
I think that the transition from the JPE, or really the breakdown of the JPE with World War I and World War II, isn't that also the collapse of the friend-enemy distinction? Because
yes,
right, because we know who we are, we know who our enemy is. We don't like our enemy; they are our enemy. But we also have a certain respect for our enemy, and we recognize that we are their enemy, and it's probably in everyone's best interest that we put some guardrails on this thing. But the problem with the small L liberal order is that, I think this is Schmitt's argument, that liberals with a lowercase l, they stop thinking in terms of friends and enemies. They no longer find it acceptable to have an antagonist on the world stage in their region or elsewhere. And so they try to make all of that go away. But then people who don't accept that, they become even worse than the enemy. I think that's the basic idea. And so there's something very dangerous about liberalism. It denies the friend-enemy distinction and therefore relegates its actual enemies who don't go away something worse than enemies, problems that need to be rooted out at all costs. And, I will say that I don't know to what extent this is American society now or just human nature, and this is true everywhere, but especially a lot of progressives in America today, they really do not recognize the possibility that a well-informed, morally decent person might disagree with them on whatever they believe. I mean, this is a totally trivial example. It's just the most recent one that comes to mind. I saw a clip of Anne Hathaway on The View, and she made this argument, this pro-choice argument. I mean, obviously, she's in favor of access to abortion for women up to a certain point, probably up until the third trimester or something, if she's kind of a standard progressive. But then she immediately followed that by saying, this is not a moral position, which it's so deeply ignorant and arrogant. It's like she doesn't recognize that she's making a moral argument. Now, it's fine to make a moral argument and say, I will defend my moral argument. I will defend the premises of my view on abortion to those who disagree. It's one thing to say that. It's another to say that this isn't even a moral argument, because it is a moral argument. And there are very sophisticated people who object to abortion, and they have their reasons, and you may disagree with them. But to deny that your position on abortion is even a moral argument, like it's not controversial, that is very disturbing to me. And it kind of reminds me of Schmitt's critique of liberalism.
I've got a whole bunch of ideas running here. So one of them is, and you'll probably edit this out, that's fine. But
it's okay. I probably won't, John. Go ahead.
One of them is that I've changed my views on abortion. I used to be for it, and my ex and I did have an abortion because I got her pregnant after we'd been together like a month, and I didn't know if this was just a fling or what it was, and neither one of us had any money. We were both like in our 20s, so it seemed like the right thing to do. Now, because my spiritual orientation has undergone in the past decade a complete transformation, I'm against it. For the following reason, the soul has agreed to a particular body. It has agreed, it's even been given roughly a life preview of what to expect in terms of the big things. And the individual chooses, after a while of searching for the correct parents that will have the correct genetic combination, to create a body that will suit the personality of that particular soul. So the soul has gone to a lot of trouble. It's done a lot of research before it incarnates with its guides on the other side, its elders and guides, a lot of consultation on its karma. So it's chosen that specific fetus to incarnate within. And so, yeah, you can kill it. You can get rid of it. And the soul will just bounce back to the other side, but it'll have to do the research all over again, find another set of parents. So it's just a big hassle for everyone. So I'm against it, but for that reason, perhaps my views are wrong about the spirit world. I don't think they are, but I've changed my opinion. But on the other hand, I do recognize that we're approaching 9 billion people here, and birth control, yes, there needs to be some form of contraception, yeah, absolutely. But abortion, I think, once you've allowed that to happen, other than rape, perhaps that's a separate case. But once a woman has allowed a man to come inside of her, she has basically given him permission to impregnate her. But now all of a sudden she has second thoughts and she doesn't want to take responsibility. I think that's a lack of responsibility there. Yeah. I think you're being very cheap and trivial about human life with that kind of behavior. So,
in my opinion, a lot of pro-choice activists or just people who are pro-choice, they not intentionally, but effectively dehumanize unborn babies. I'm pretty anti-abortion myself, not on the grounds that you are, but I was also going to say that I don't share your concerns about overpopulation. I'm actually more on the Elon Musk side of this argument. I'm more worried about underpopulation. I'm worried about very important populations of the world not reproducing themselves. But anyway, we don't need to litigate that here.
No. So the other thing I was going to mention is Giorgio Agamben, in his book Homo Sacer, who presupposes Carl Schmitt. And of course, Agamben is a liberal, very much to the left. He's got this interesting idea about, so we were talking about what would replace the nation state. So we've got Schmitt's idea of the gross realm, but Agamben has this idea that the concentration camp mentality is around us, but it's invisible. We're not aware of it. So he makes a distinction between two Greek words called bios and zoe, which are two Greek words for life.
Mm.
He says that zoe simply means bare naked life, as in zoological, living things. They're bare naked. Whereas bios, on the other hand, implies a human existence with inscriptions, data, cards, bios in the sense of biography. You're inscribed into a juridical, political, legal order that confers rights upon you. And you have these rights. You're an individual, you're inscribed into the state.
Mm-hmm.
The fact of the matter is that those rights can be withdrawn from you. And if the rights are withdrawn from you, then you are put into a different ontological status, namely that of homo sacer, which now is a Latin term that means it's a person who can be killed with impunity, because the person is not protected by the state or a religion or any kind of supra-organism that we all depend upon for our existence, every single one of us. But certain individuals can fall through the cracks, and they can have their biopolitical, and he borrows from Foucault this term biopolitical, they can have their biopolitical rights withdrawn from them, and suddenly they're non-citizens. So they can be killed without consequence. This is the situation of the Jews, of course, in the concentration camps. They have had their biopolitical rights completely withdrawn from them. And he says then that, and a fun, popular analogy to this is Steven Spielberg's very underrated film called The Terminal, which is based roughly on a true story about a guy who is from, in the movie, a fictitious country, who gets stranded at an airport because his country goes to war and they won't accept him back. And yet he can't cross legally over out of JFK into New York City, which is where he's there. He can't legally cross. So he's stuck in this airport. So he's in a mode of bare naked life, homo sacer, bare naked life. Anything can happen to this guy and there won't be any consequences to what happens to him. So it is a kind of concentration camp mentality, Agamben says, that is spreading. And it's part of this biopolitical tracking of individuals, with ARFID chips and all these kinds of things that the state can withdraw rights from you. We all take our rights for granted from the state, but Agamben says that they can be withdrawn from you and you can find yourself in the status of homo sacer. Think of Guantanamo Bay.
Right.
That's all those people there at Guantanamo Bay were basically in the mode of homo sacer.
And was it our abortion discussion that made you think of that? Because you could all.
No, I had thought of this first. Then you brought up abortion, and then I went around to that.
Oh, I see.
Wait, I was going to do Agamben, but I got to say this.
Well, no, because I was thinking maybe you were regarding the unborn baby as
not having any rights,
right? Or something like that. But maybe not, which is fine. Maybe what we could do in the last 20 minutes is turn the discussion back to Russia a little bit, because we kind of, as is our wont, going all over the place. We began by talking about Dugin, but actually a lot of what we said about Dugin wasn't really about Russia. Obviously, I'm no expert on Russia. I don't think you consider yourself a particular expert on Russia, but
no, not at all.
Maybe we could just talk about a few things that Spengler and Dugin think about Russia specifically, the Russian soul and Russian pseudomorphoses. One thing I'll say at the outset is that I think that the way I think about pseudomorphoses is that there are two kinds. I actually think of them as the Spenglerian kind and then the Ebertian kind, Ebert referring to you, because
the term is Ebertian.
Oh, Ebertian. Okay.
Just for future reference.
That's funny.
Some guy said that to me once. Like, I want to read some Ebertian culture theory, and I'm like,
right.
You're the first person who's ever said that.
So the Spenglerian pseudomorphosis would be basically the birth of the Magian in the Greco-Roman world.
That's like
in other words,
classic model of it.
Yeah, right. And the geological analogy is more apt there, but basically a certain culture lies really heavily over the land, but something new is being born within the internal proletariat, but it has to express itself in these alien forms because it's completely surrounded by this dominant dying culture. But then the Ebertian pseudomorphosis would be an external import. So you're Russia, and then a bunch of Western ideas come in, either because the leader invites them in or because Lenin takes the train from Germany to Russia and brings them in. But those are two different kinds of pseudomorphoses that are worth distinguishing. All of the key Russian pseudomorphoses are Ebertian pseudomorphoses, right? They're external imports from the West to Russia. So I just wanted to note that at the outset. Like, I think Spengler would say that, Dugin would say that, and I think it's kind of obvious. Really, from the 1700s from the 1700s onward, there's just been wave after wave of Western fads, Western ideas, Western materialism, Western economic modes being exported to Russia, and Russia receiving them. And according to Dugin and Spengler, not really jiving with them at the end of the day. So one thing that Dugin and Spengler have in common is that they're not ashamed. They don't cringe when they talk about a culture's soul. They are comfortable talking in those terms. Of course, if you go into any social sciences or even humanities department in the American Academy today, and you say there is a Russian soul, you'll get laughed out of the room. But
yes,
Dugin,
to interrupt, sorry, but
no,
William Arwen Thompson, when I convinced him to read Spengler, had a similar response. He said to this idea of civilizations having souls, he said, that just makes it too easy to otherize a civilization, to make it other. But in a way, isn't that the point? Isn't that the point? This is multipolarity, multiple Daseins. Yeah, of course it otherizes.
Right. And of course, you could call it otherizing. You could also call it just having respect and reverence for a culture's distinctiveness.
Sure. In a derogatory sense, oh, this shitty Russian culture, let's go destroy it. You know, regime change, like that's ever going to happen with Putin. That's a pipe dream.
By the way, anyone who's watching, I would highly recommend that you either read Spengler's essay on the two faces of Russia or watch John's
because I actually
video on it.
On YouTube, I read the entire essay.
And you add some of your own commentary, but that is
I knew it's hard to find. It's in an obscure paperback. So so it's there on YouTube.
It's a really interesting essay. I did not read it.
And there was a lot of prescient stuff in that.
Exactly. That's what I was going to say.
The end of communism is inevitable.
Right.
It's like this is just a temporary Western pseudomorphic experiment. It's not going to last. He was dead on about that. And this is 1922, I think.
Right. Kind of in the wake of the Bolshevik Revolution in World War I, he was writing this. So let me say a few things that I got from what you said, and then you can kind of run with it. And maybe we'll end there. I wish we could talk a little bit more about Dugin too, and his view of the Russian soul, for lack of a better word, and pseudomorphoses. I actually think Dugin misused the term pseudomorphosis a little bit in his conversation with you, because he said that he even thinks pseudomorphosis applies to the West, because the West is rejecting liberalism. But I wouldn't call that a pseudomorphosis. That's more like an internal proletariat rejecting a dominant minority.
That's more Toynbee than
right. But anyway, so Spengler thinks that nomadism, and wanderlust are very central to the Russian soul. His symbol is the endless plain, the Eurasian steppe. That's part of why, in his view, I think the Russian people are more oriented east than west, because to the east lie the great steppes, the endless plain. He speaks of this dark mystical longing for Byzantium, for Constantinople, the view of Moscow as the third Rome, first papal Rome and second the Byzantine Empire. But again, there's this dark mystical longing for Byzantium / Constantinople and for Jerusalem. I think you said something like, I don't know if this was Spengler's line or your line, but that Moscow would be the fulfillment of Christ's message to Jerusalem after papal Rome and Luther. And you've made some really interesting comments about the horizontality of the Russian soul. You have these long, horizontally stretching buildings like the Hermitage, like the Kremlin. Rather than skyscrapers. You have these onion cupolas rather than spires.
Remember, I sent you. I found that one Russian guy, architect, who did horizontal skyscrapers. Remember that?
I couldn't believe it.
Insane.
It was almost like I was almost like, did John just dream this? Because it almost fits too well. And I was just thinking, maybe you've made this point, but I just thought Spengler probably would not have been surprised that the U.S. won the space race, right?
No.
The West was destined to win it. The Russians were destined to lose it, because going up, going out.
Another prediction he made this time in the Decline of the West, where he says the Russian word for heaven is nebo, which contains the letter N as a negation. Nebo. So it's a negation. So they basically deny verticality. And he says the idea of a Russians being an astronaut, that's totally ridiculous. He was correct.
I think that Spengler made the point in the essay that of all the wars that Russia was engaged in the 19th century and into the 20th century, only the Turkish wars were popular. And I think Spengler thought that the Russian people were actually more closely, had greater kinship with the Tatars and the Turks and maybe the Mongols than with the French or the German.
Yeah,
Interestingly, Dugin says that Russia is as alien from the West as India and China are. And I thought that was pretty remarkable because I don't really view it that way. I view Russia as more similar to the West than India and China, although still a distinct culture / civilization in its own right. But anyway, the anecdote from Spengler about the Russian population's support for the Turkish wars as distinct from the Russo-Japanese War or the various wars with European powers as an indication that the heart of the Russian people lies toward Central Asia, the Middle East, not so much toward Europe. Very interesting. And then, of course, the essay is largely about just this massive Ebertian pseudomorphosis in the form of, do you call it Petronism or Peter the Great?
Peter the Great, yeah. Importing
And
all the architecture and education and sciences and the university, all this stuff that goes on in the time of Peter.
and this fascinating historical analogy where he likens the Russian people's reaction to the world of capitalism and machines to the early Western civilizational reaction to Arab and Jewish moneylenders who were coming from a much more well-established civilization with cities, who had mastered
much older,
right,
and therefore further along into its cosmopolitan city intellect money phase.
Yeah. Anything you'd like to add on Spengler's view of the Russian character, the Russian soul, and maybe Dugin's too, and how they're connected?
I think that he's probably right that Russia will be the next great civilization. I think he's probably correct about that. They have so much energy and vitality. Yes, indeed, they're underpopulated, as you pointed out, at this point. I think that's only temporary, though. I think that will change over time. But yeah, I think that the future does belong to Russia. And he says also that if that is the case, then Christianity will undergo a third major transformation, and it'll have another 1,000 years, because each of these civilizations for Spengler has 1,000 years of creative life. It may last longer than that, but it's that crucial initial 1,000 years that follows the pre-cultural period and before the winter phase. And a third transformation of Christianity, which looks pretty healthy to me. Looking at the Cathedral of the Armed Forces, looks pretty spectacular, and I do not detect any kitsch there whatsoever. And you would think with a cathedral called that there would be, but it didn't look like it to me. And some other people pointed out too the other new buildings, not buildings but churches. Russia has been building for the past decade. They've got a very healthy vitality for building these churches. They rebuilt one, and I've forgotten the name of it because it was destroyed in World War II. And they just recently rebuilt that, and it looks absolutely spectacular.
And by the way, that's another thing that makes Russia kind of more similar to the territories to its east than the territories to its west. It is willing to fuse church and state.
Yes, exactly. Fusion of church and state, Magian characteristic shared by both the Caliph in Islam and in the Byzantine world. Justinian was both head of the church as well as the state. Yeah, it's a definite thing that Russia shares with the East.
Right. And obviously there was a close connection between state and church for much of Western civilizational history, although that really ended as we got more into the modern phase. But yeah, it's notable that not in Russia, not only are the people pretty pious, I think. I mean, maybe that's overstated, but at least compared to any Western populations, the people are pretty pious. But not only that, the state is willing to invest considerable resources in these monumental constructions. And again, it's very interesting that, I mean, you have a better artistic eye than I do, but you think very highly of this cathedral. I think it looks really cool. I honestly do. I watched the drone video of it, and from the exterior,
the drone flying through. It's beautiful.
It's really cool.
Absolutely luminous architecture. I would love to go there and visit. If I ever do have the good luck of going to visit Moscow, I'm definitely going to go to that church.
On the Russian character, one thing Dugin says about this is that, again, and sometimes this line gets quoted out of context, but I think he said at some point that the Russian has neither reason nor will. But Millerman said that don't misunderstand this. He doesn't mean that Russian people can't be rational or anything like that. His point is that Russia has never tried to become scientifically rational as the final goal of human development. It is still religious. It is still mystical. It has not overthrown religion. Now, I think Spengler would say maybe it will as it proceeds along its civilizational arc. But at least up until now, there has been no Russian Voltaire, no Russian Enlightenment. Faith is still as important as reason, whereas in the West, that is not the case anymore. Again, from Dugin's point of view,
long gone in the West.
Yeah, right. The West is the devil that turned its back on God and fell in love with its own intellectual creation.
Right. Before we do part two, I'll watch some more Dugin videos and just see how much more of him I can absorb so that we can chew on him.
Yeah, okay, that sounds good. So we'll do a kind of Dugin, Spengler, or just Dugin round two.
Yeah, because I think with Dugin is such a complex thinker that we've probably only touched the surface.
Oh, no doubt. I mean, I
regard Dugin as a genuine philosopher. Okay, as distinct from a public intellectual like Jordan Peterson, Slavoj Žižek. These guys are public intellectuals. Sam Harris. They're not philosophers in any way, shape, or form. And it was funny Dugin making fun of Žižek as basically, a silly comedian of ideas, which is basically what he is. And I've read a whole bunch of Žižek books. I went through a Žižek phase because I really liked his writing style because it's really funny. But it is all just Lacan, Lacan, Lacan. No original thought, no original ideas, just the application of Lacan to this book, that novel, this film, and it's just Lacan. I do the same thing Žižek does, except that I don't just apply like Spengler to everyone. I draw from a whole bunch of different thinkers. Žižek really doesn't. And so I don't see him as much of a thinker at all. But Dugin is the genuine article.
Yeah.
And I felt that when I was interviewing him, when I said that he gave me an inferiority complex, I was pretty intimidated. I don't know if you can see that.
You seemed pretty deferential. You were like Professor Dugin, and you wanted him to laugh at your jokes, which I can understand.
That's what I told. I don't know if it was you or somebody else. I said one of my goals is to make Dugin laugh because I have never seen him laugh ever in any interview he has ever given.
He must not have a great sense of humor because you were giving him definite opportunities to laugh that I think can't be explained away by the language.
Smiled a few times, and then there was one brief laugh when we were talking about American pop. No, I got him. I got him to crack a smile. I don't think anyone else ever has. So it was a personal triumph for me. Personal triumph. All right,
well, John, you'll be hearing from me soon. Thanks so much.
All right, Brandon.
Great to see you.
Absolutely, great conversation as always. I always look forward to these.
So do I.
Okay, take care.
Bye. Be well.
Bye.